Okay, so as we're gathering to our seats, let me start the introduction on the next individual. Probably doesn't need any introduction if you're paying any attention to the Sea Power Committee over in the House Armed Services Committee. The ranking member, Rob Wittman, Republican from Virginia, he basically caught everybody's real attention last week during the initial two hearings with OSD and the Navy on the 2021 force posture hearings. He has what I would consider strong opinions on the need to add a second Virginia-class submarine and order back to the Navy into the 2021 budget request. But I got to tell you, he's much, much bigger than that when you think about it. Not only has he been a strong overseer of the U.S. Air Force bomber and the mobility programs, the B-21, the B-2, DMS 2021 retirement of the C-17, broken B-1s, B-52 upgrades, and KC-46 RVs. I mean, he is truly about how are we going to get our force into the fight and how do we sustain the fight. So without further ado, please welcome Congressman Rob Wittman.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Well, Steve, thank you, and good morning. Gosh, what a great honor to be back with you today to talk about all the challenges we have up in the Hill. Before I get into the NDAA, I do want to talk a little bit about the environment that we find ourselves in. I think sometimes folks outside of this room don't really get the challenge that we have before us and the things that are happening around us. You know, Cold War time, it was one opponent. It was Russia. We out-resourced Russia, and the rest is history. Today, as we speak, after our nearly 19 years of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, you know, we find ourselves now in this age of great power competition. And we find ourselves with not a single opponent, but multiple opponents. We find ourselves working against China that has an organized, state-sponsored cyber threat to the United States, continues to steal intellectual property, you know, is not our friend by any measure. They want to defeat us not just strategically, but economically. You look at Russia. Russia continues to try to push out in their influence in the realm. If you look just here off the East Coast, you know, we had for years been used to, after the Cold War, not having Russian presence off the East Coast. Folks, last year I was out fishing off the coast of Virginia, and I looked and I said, that ship doesn't look like a U.S. ship, but it sure looks like a military ship. I wonder what ship that was. And guess what? Russian intelligence gathering ship. This year went out to visit the Eisenhower, and they were out there on her pre-deployment exercises, and guess what? The U.S. Russian intelligence gathering ship Leonov was out there. Now, the USS Nitsa was shadowing her to keep her away from the Ike, but here we are 2 years in a row with the Russians off the East Coast, looking very carefully at what we're doing here. Those things should concern all of us, and I want to make sure that we are keeping those things in mind. You see what happens with Iran and with North Korea. So the list of our challenges continues to grow. I want to make sure, too, that we not only look at the scope of those challenges and making sure that we have a strong U.S. military to deter a conflict, but here's where we will prevail strategically. You know, we are a nation of innovators and creators. We can counter any threat out there, period, without exception. The key is, though, how do we make sure we do that within the realm of reality? And the realm of reality that we face today are resources. We won the Cold War because we just out-resourced the Russians. They ran out of money. Today, that's not going to be the case. We have multiple adversaries, and we also have $23 trillion of debt, so you can't keep borrowing money. You can't borrow money from your adversaries. So the question is going to be this: how do we do more per our dollar than the Chinese do per their yuan or the Russians do per their ruble? And folks, we have shown that we can do more per our dollar than any other adversary in the face of the earth. We can get more out of our unit of currency than anybody else can. But as we look into the future and we see top lines on defense budgets are not going to be growing like they have in the past couple of years, it's going to be up to all of us. This is a team sport. It will be up to the Congress. It'll be up to the executive branch. It'll be up to the service branches. It'll be up to each and every one of you in this room to look at how do we accomplish that? How do we do more with our resources than our adversaries do? How do we use technology? How do we use innovation and creation to solve the problems before us? How do we make sure that we are using that to deter our enemies and, if necessary, to defeat our enemies, period? That's the future that we're looking at. And that's what's going to provide us the opportunity to prevail. Let me talk a little bit about this year's, first of all, the president's budget, but then what we're facing in the NDAA. Being able to project power is critically important. Tip of the spear is going to be the Navy, Marine Corps team, and the Air Force, and the Army will be part of that in a number of different ways. But the bottom line is this. When you have a budget that comes over and says in the shipbuilding account, the SCN account, that we're going to be building 8 ships, 6 of which are warships, the other 2 are essentially tugboats. I know people don't like me saying that, but that's essentially what they are. So we're going to deal with that. And then we're talking about retiring 11 ships, talking about retiring 4 LCSs, 4 cruisers, and 3 amphibs. Folks, I got C's in math, but I can tell you, looking at that, building 8, retiring 11, we're supposed to get to 355 by 2030. You know, I'm not a great mathematician, but it sure doesn't seem that that's going to get us to 355 by 2030. So the question is how do we make sure we're fixing that? One of the reductions in the shipbuilding budget was Virginia-class submarines, one of the most requested assets in our U.S. inventory. And where we have undersea superiority, we have got to be able to add that additional submarine back in the budget. And we are doing everything possible to see that happen. But to tell you that it'll be a simple task would be underestimating. I can tell you, Mr. Courtney and I, 2 years ago, tried to add a Virginia-class submarine into the budget after the president's budget came over, and I can tell you that both Mr. Courtney and I still have blood on the deck plates from that battle that went on trying to get that accomplished, and we never did. But we're going to have to do that. Other things that have to be talked about this year, and that is you're talking about retiring the first 4 LCSs, and I understand that they're supposed to be test platforms, but think about this. Think about this from a logical standpoint. You're going to retire 4 LCSs, and they're supposed to be test platforms, but they're also supposed to be modular ships where you move mission packages off and on. So if it's a modular ship, how does it lose its utility here just years into availability for the ships? Just doesn't make sense to me. And when you still don't have a mine warfare package that is available now for those ships, seems like to me that we ought to be keeping those ships in the inventory. I understand the issues with cruisers, the cost of modernizing, but we have a tremendous demand on the ballistic missile defense mission, on the carrier strike group mission. So the question is if we're going to retire those CGs, what are we going to do with building new Flight 3 DDGs? And if we're going to make sure we're on pace to replace those ships, I've got no problem with it, but it requires a plan. And that leads us into, where's the plan? We need a 30-year shipbuilding plan. And as you know, Secretary Esper said the other day that, he's going to look at the plan. He's going to have the DepSecDev take a deep dive into really what we need for our Navy going forward. And the problem is that's going to be months in the future. So how does the plan from the Pentagon and the plan from the Navy on 30-year shipbuilding, how does that inform what we need to do on NDAA? It doesn't. So again, another thing that's out of sequence. If you look at the number of ships that we need, how do we get there, retiring more ships than what we're building, looking at trying to get to 355 by 2030, all these things are tremendously important. I asked Secretary Motley the other day, I said, it seems like to me it's impossible to get to a 355-ship Navy by 2030. And I was expecting him to give me a direct answer, and he did. He said, I don't think it's impossible, which is good, but the key is if it's not impossible, then show us the path to where we know that it's not impossible. Show us the path where we know what does Congress need to do to get us there. Because as I said, where we need to be in building capability across the spectrum is a team sport. It's not just the Pentagon. It's not just the executive branch. It's not just the Congress, but it's also industry. Everybody has to be part of this team because if we're going to get where we need to go, and if we're going to do that in the most efficient way possible and use the resources in the best way possible, everybody has to be part of this effort. And that goes the same when looking at what the challenge is in the future. We've become much more active now in gaming out what the future holds. And the wargaming's gotten pretty good. But the key with the wargaming is how do we make sure it reflects reality? And that is, I've asked the folks that are doing the wargaming, who's in the room? You know, listen, it's great to have the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps in the room, the Space Force now. It's great to have folks in the Pentagon in the room. It's great to have folks there from the President's cabinet in the room. But why wouldn't you want to have somebody from Congress in the room? Congress does the authorization and the resourcing. Wouldn't you want them to be in the room so they can have some situational awareness about what the reality is? Would it be nice, too, to have some situational awareness as to what the realities would be if we find ourselves in a large-scale conflict? Because it's not just the strategic and tactical issues you have to deal with, it's the political issues that you have to deal with. So we want to make sure that we're getting all of that information as part of how we are getting things done. Let me talk about one other thing that doesn't always make the headlines, but is incredibly important, and that is logistics. Logistics in the realm of surge sea lift capacity. You know, I talked yesterday at our posture hearing with Secretary McCarthy, who was just here, and with General McConville about the things that we are facing on the Army side. And as we know, 90% of the job that the Army needs to get done in order to get to the fight is going to take place at sea. The key is if we have a ready reserve fleet that is challenged to say the least, and if we look at the turbo activation, the unannounced activation that was done of our ready reserve fleet on September the 17th, where the requirement says we need an 85% availability of those ships. And when under the turbo activation, we actually saw that the availability of those ships was at 40%. It's great that General McConville said yesterday, yes, if called upon, we can get to the Indo-Pacific. It's great that he said yes. The question is does the capability match the desire? And I would argue that we are at a very, very challenging point with ready reserve fleet capability. Also looking, too, at the whole realm of surge sea lift, and that is the Maritime Security Program. You know, today, as we speak, there are, I think, 83 ships available in the Maritime Security Program. Put that in perspective, and when we mobilized to go to the Gulf, to Kuwait for the Gulf War, there were over 300 ships in the Maritime Security Program. So the question is you know, how do we make all these things work? Listen, we can have the best warships in the world. We can have the best brigade combat teams in the world. We can have the best of everything, but if we can't get them to the fight, then what do we have? We don't have what we need. So all those things that don't make the headlines become incredibly important, especially on deterrence. And we need to make sure that we have those ships, that they are active, that they can get there. We've got to be able to recapitalize that pretty quickly. We've actually given the Navy permission to buy 2 ships plus another 5 ships. We can buy a roll-on, roll-off ship today at about $60 million a copy. These things are 15 years old or younger, and put them right to work. You know how many ships the Navy has bought? 0. And we've given them that authorization now for 2 years going. And listen, I understand it's not at the top of their list. But I talked to the Army and said, listen, if you guys are going to get there, you need to start pounding the drum and saying, you know, we need some ships in the ready reserve fleet in order for us to be able to get there. So logistics, surge sea lift capacity becomes a critical element, as well as what do we do to defend our tankers. You know, we have a great tanker fleet, TAOs and TAKEs, to be able to get fuel to where it needs to be. But guess what we don't have? The ability to protect those ships. All we have to do is look at World War II. 82% of the tonnage sunk in World War II were not warships. They were tankers and supply ships. And all our adversaries have to do is say, we're not going to shoot at a ship that can shoot back. All we got to do is to take out the ability for them to sustain themselves, and then the rest becomes less of a challenge. So we also have to make sure we secure our tankers. Now, I put a bill in last year to be able to do that. We haven't gotten it done yet, but we will be back this year because we have to protect the ability to sustain. You know, we look at what we can do in the first 30 days, pretty doggone capable, but looking at what we can do past 30 days causes me to lose some sleep at night. So anyway, so those are things that are before us, things that we're going to have to address in this year's NDAA, things that I believe we will address in this year's NDAA. But we have to make sure that we're doing that in a timely fashion. We have to make sure we're doing it in the most resource-efficient manner possible. Because if we don't, then we won't get the whole myriad of things that we need to get done. It's a matter of personnel. Both the Navy, the Army, the Marine Corps, all the service branches are looking at having to increase personnel. We want to make sure, too, that we're taking care of personnel so we have good retention rates. That's incredibly important, as well as recruitment. We want to make sure, too, that we are modernizing at the right pace. For all of our service branches now, we are at one of those tipping points where we have a lot of modernization to do. We have a lot of old aircraft, older ships out there, older weapon systems, older combat systems. We're going to have to recapitalize that. You know, we do that about once every 50 years. We did that back in the 80s. Now's the time for us to get things done now and to get this done properly. So with that, let me go to your questions, thoughts, ideas, and concerns, and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
I'm terrified to give him the microphone, sir.
That's right.
He's compelling me.
Congressman, thank you. I'm Harlan Ullman.
Yes.
To be provocative, I wonder if you're being too complacent about the state of the Navy. There was a very able CNO who was confirmed, who was forced to retire in the spring. In the summer, we haven't had a secretary for 6 months. Mm-hmm. The Ford class is plagued with problems that may not be fixable. The Virginia classes already have overruns and delays. The Columbia class is in real trouble. LCS has not proven to be a really able ship. Zumwalt is terribly expensive. Should you not be more worried? And who is really performing the oversight to get the Navy to be able to do the things that it needs to be done?
Well, listen, there are some concerns there, no doubt about it. Our job on Sea Power is to make sure that we are indeed doing the oversight. Mr. Courtney and I will be flying out to the Ford to look at the elevators, both the lower level and upper level elevators, to make sure we understand what's going on there, to make sure we know where Ford is going to be. The good news is the Navy is going to truncate the time period for her to go on deployment. They're not going to wait the large period of time they normally do after shock testing, which will take place in late spring, early summer, the workups after that, pre-deployment, and then going on deployment. So they're able to compress that. But there are some things left for the Ford to be able to address. And we have to hold the industry accountable as well as folks within the Navy and the Department of Defense. So I think we can get there. As far as the Virginia class, there has been some extension on the time frames there. Again, Mr. Courtney and I have sat down and gone to the yards to look at exactly what's happening there. We see a very aggressive schedule to be able to truncate that time back down to where it needs to be. On Columbia class, I'm cautiously optimistic about Columbia. I'm looking at the investments that have been made there, the efforts that are ongoing with production there at Quonset. Been to Philadelphia too to look at the testing of the permanent magnet induction motor, to look at the plate issue that was there. So I think that they are on the right track to be able to get those things done. But there's no two ways about it. There are challenges there. It would be nice to have a permanent secretary. Secretary Motley, I think, as acting secretary, is doing all that he can. But what they're trying to do is to figure out where things are in his conversation with Secretary Esper. As you know, the hiccup with Admiral Moran now to Admiral Gilday. Admiral Gilday is on board and doing everything possible to get where it needs to be. One of the things I think is incredibly important, and we've talked to both Secretary Motley and CNO Gilday on this, is that 30-year shipbuilding plan is incredibly important. And if it doesn't come to Congress until after the authorization and appropriations process, then the question is where's the utility of that for this year? It should be here this year because I believe there are a lot of things that we need to do, and our decisions need to be informed by what's in that 30-year shipbuilding plan. So there's one of the places where I think the Navy really needs to speed things up. I understand Secretary Esper wants to get a full grasp of this because I think there's a disparity in what he understands and what he's hearing from members of Congress and what he's hearing from folks elsewhere within the Navy. So no doubt there are challenges there. We have to be up for the challenge on the congressional side and getting our job done on oversight and on Sea Power.
There's time for one last one, sir?
Sure.
Sir,
Yes, sir.
you getting any information on the integration of hypersonics with the naval force structure as to what ships that'll go on and in what numbers? And have you heard anything about the frigate program and that announcement?
First of all, on the frigate program, they are still on track to be able to make that decision. One of the reasons behind them retiring these LCSs early is wanting to get to frigate at a faster pace. The key is if you're going to retire LCS, you're still going to have a gap between retiring those 4 ships and having frigate availability. The Navy needs to get on with that. We understand that will happen here towards the end of this year, but they have to stay on track there. As far as integrating hypersonics into current Navy weapons platforms, We haven't gotten a lot of definition about where that is. We understand it's at the conceptual phase now about what those weapons would be. We've gotten a brief. I've actually been to the Navy facilities where they're doing the testing of these various platforms and the proposals on how those platforms will be integrated into existing Navy architecture. But there haven't been any final decisions that I'm aware of that have been made concerning integrating those hypersonic weapons.
Mr.
Sure.
Durnan compelled me to force in the last question. I'm sorry, sir.
Sure, please
Maybe make it
do.
quick.
Yes.
If it's a good one, it's on.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody talking about math and 355, but frankly, trying to build capability by doing mathematics is like trying to drive your car looking at the hood ornament. And we should be looking not at how many LCSs or aircraft carriers we're building, but we're talking about a Navy that's going to be around for 50 years. So why isn't the discussion and the debate about unmanned vehicles and things of that nature that actually one for one or probably one for two replace these big ships?
Yeah. I think unmanned platforms, lightly manned platforms, as Secretary Esper refers to them, are critically important. But I still think you need to have the metric to be able to have the discussion about what does a 355-ship Navy mean. As you've said, a 30-year shipbuilding plan will inform what does the architecture of the Navy need to include. How do we look at these unmanned platforms? What I want to make sure is that the Navy is doing it at the right pace. What we don't want is to build a bunch of unmanned platforms and then figure out that we have a hard time integrating them into fleet operations or understanding how we're going to do that. I think those platforms have a lot of utility. The question is what do they do best? I think they can certainly be platforms that carry weapons. The key is how do you integrate them? How do you get the most out of those platforms? I think at some point, yes, you will want to count those platforms in the entire part of the Navy. I think you want to do that at a fast pace. But what I don't want to happen is for the Navy to go breakneck speed down a path and say, let's build a bunch of these, and then we figure out that they haven't worked. We see that with LCS. We said, let's do that. Let's build 2 versions of LCS, and the world will be great. And then we figured out, well, hasn't quite turned out the way that we thought it was. So those unmanned platforms absolutely have to be part of the future of the Navy. We absolutely have to look at how do we count them as part of the total Navy force structure. The key is how do we do that at the right place to where we are, again, using our resources most efficiently and getting the maximum capacity and capability out of the platforms that we build. And unmanned will absolutely be part of that future, and we need to aggressively pursue that, but do it the right way.
Gentlemen, a
Thank
big
you.
round of applause for
Thank you,
Congressman
folks.
Rob
Thank you.
Witt-
Steve, thank you. Thank you.